There's not a lot of time to move timidly. There is history there that no matter what background we are from, we can call upon and identify with to be bold and courageous and have backbone in this moment.
Welcome to Nonprofits Now, Leading Today, a new podcast that gives nonprofit leaders a playbook to tackle today's most pressing leadership challenges. I am so delighted today to be with Vanessa Priya Daniel, who has had a wonderful career in social change, starting as an organizer and then moving into the philanthropy world. And she has a new book we're going to talk about today. I'm so thrilled to welcome you. Hello, Vanessa.
Hi, Stacy. Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Going from organizer to philanthropy is not the usual trajectory. Did you find it helped you to have been an organizer first?
Oh, absolutely. And I think particularly going to a public foundation where you have to raise all the money you're giving out, what I found was that fundraising it's organizing, it's just with resources and it's all about relationships as well. So, but I think that cutting my teeth as an organizer really instilled in me a really primary accountability to grassroots communities, to the most vulnerable communities. It instilled in me an understanding of what the work looks like on the ground to create change. And, just a real commitment and dedication to moving resources in that direction and to listening deeply to the wisdom of communities about what is needed and where resources are needed for what strategies in order to create change.
And that's what brings us to talking about the new book that you have written, which I hope everyone has a chance to read.
The title is Unrig the Game, What Women of Color Can Teach Everyone About Winning.
Terrific. And I especially want to talk about the winning part because I know
Yes.
that that's a really pretty key piece. And not all leadership books actually talk about that. But you had what I think is an amazing privilege of talking to 45 amazing leaders, all women of color. Can you talk to us about what you learned and maybe give us some examples of the people you met who are in the book?
Yeah, well, I mean, the inspiration for this book really is the heart and the brilliance of the women of color leaders who I have been so blessed to know over my more than 25 years now in movement. And elders like Dolores Huerta, I mean, what an honor of a lifetime to be able to sit with her and talk with her, Representative Pramila Jayapal, national leaders like Linda Sarsour and Ashley Woodard Henderson, down to like these beautiful young folks who are organizing on campuses today. I mean, it was just a complete masterclass for me. And I invited them to really help me answer three questions. First, what makes so many women of color MVPs of social change? Second, what is benching us? And third, what can everybody do about it? So we delve into that in the book. The title is Unrig the Game, and the game that they unrigged when I talked to them wasn't just about leadership positions for them. They actually talked about how we can unrig a lot of the oppressive systems that impact us, but also how we can unrig a lot of the dysfunction in movements themselves. So there's a lot of wisdom on all those fronts that I benefited from, and I hope that folks do who read the book as well.
Absolutely. Tell us a story or two about the leaders who you were really struck by and what it was about them that made such a difference and how you think that they won.
When I was sitting down to write this book, I really wrote it because I want social justice movements to win. And I want them to win like I want my two daughters to have things like self-determination over their bodies, and I want them to have a democracy to live in and a planet to live on. And I'm very clear that no team that's serious about winning benches its best players for no reason, especially in the clutch moment of a big game. We need our full strength. Much of that strength comes from our best and brightest leaders, so many of whom are women of color. And so when we think about the points that many progressives count on our side of the scoreboard, so many of those were put there by women of color. We have, 30 million kids who don't learn hungry in this country because of the Black women who started the Black Panther Breakfast Program, which catalyzed what then became free and reduced lunch in our public schools. We've got leaders like Ai-jen Poo and Alicia Garza that were a part of the fight alongside so many domestic workers to make it so that 8 million families in this country can enjoy in-home and community-based care for their loved ones. And that doesn't happen without them fighting, so hard for it to be included in the American Rescue Act. These are some of the kinds of folks who and the kinds of efforts that have really changed things for us. And I think we've just never had this conversation in the public square about how much more we could be winning if we valued their strategic brilliance and if we stopped making leadership so treacherous for them.
You talk about the superpowers the women you interviewed have. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So these are three superpowers that many women of color leaders bring to leadership. And they're superpowers that we can all adopt and use in the fight for freedom, equality, and democracy. Number one is 360-degree vision. And we know that fascism is like the very worst of America. It's that three-headed monster of white supremacy, patriarchy, and extractive capitalism. And it's that monster on steroids. And it hurts all of us. So 360 vision really sees and tackles all three of those things at once. And it makes sense that women of color who have been battling some version of this same monster for hundreds of years in this country for our very survival actually have something to teach America about how to fight back against this.
How do you get that if you don't have it? And what do you exactly mean by that? Can you talk more about how you see that play out?
When you look at leaders like Katherine Granger and all of the folks in New York who were behind winning Amendment 1 that enshrined gender rights protections in the New York Constitution last November, not just for cis women, but for trans and gender nonconforming people, like that is an example of 360 work in action. And it is so important because these types of oppression are actually interlocking. And so we have to address them simultaneously in order to get free of any of them.
And really true of all of the problems that philanthropy is trying to tackle. They're all interconnected, and you have to be able to see that. Do you think people can learn to get better at that?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, I think we are all in our, journey of learning and improving the accuracy of our lens that when we're looking at an issue, but it is possible to develop your skills to look at an issue and become aware of the racial and gender and class dimensions of that. And it is actually very powerful. I've worked with scores of feminist funders in particular who have gone from a frame that mainly looked just at gender for white women and seen them expand out to be able to look at what gender looks like with an added class lens, and also for women of color, and also for trans and gender nonconforming folks. And they've been very successful with it. And you know what? When we do this, we expand our ability to invite people into movements, and that strengthens our ability to win on the things that we and the trustees also care about.
Absolutely. And then let's talk a little bit more about generosity and how does that play out within organizations and among organizations that are in coalition with each other? How do you want to see that? Because obviously part of it is what you said, making sure nobody's left behind. But how do we make sure that we treat each other that way?
So it really is this ethos of rising by lifting others. And I also think generosity in terms of your question of collaboration, there's a great example from Serena Khan, who's the former CEO of the Women's Foundation of California, tells a really beautiful story about, they had weathered major budget and staffing cuts. And, she brought her team together for a retreat to really dream about what they wanted the organization to be, the values they wanted to embody, in order to deliver for the communities they serve. And building that shared vision that was really grounded in a center of gravity of what they wanted to accomplish externally in the world for the most vulnerable communities, enabled them to really focus and also let go of some of the things that weren't in service of that. And so I think that way of leaning into the work in a collaborative way is really a hallmark of how women of color lead.
Is there anything else that you think effective leaders can learn from what you learned from these amazing women?
Yeah, well, I mean, I do want to talk about boldness for a minute, if it's okay, because I do think this is an important one for philanthropy in this time. We are a field that is often been plagued by timidity and this sense of risk aversion that is challenging for us even on a good day. And, we're in a rainy day right now. And so, boldness, when we look at how it shows up, it looks like the squad in Congress. It looks like 15 years of polling showing us that women of color of all races are the strongest supporters of climate action. This kind of tenacity and persistence where you don't start in the middle, where you think it's palatable, or you think it's safe, but you start in the bold place and you plant your flag there and pull things in that direction. A great example is the Green New Deal. Rihanna Gunn Wright, a Black woman, wrote it. AOC, a Latina, was the first member of Congress to champion it. And Varshini Prakash, a South Asian woman, galvanized young people at the grassroots to push for it. And then when it stalled out, it was Representative Pramila Jayapal, chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, who fought alongside others to make sure that core elements were included in the Inflation Reduction Act that passed. So that meant that the largest outlay of resources we have seen to address climate change includes 40% allocation to the most vulnerable communities. So this approach, this antidote to timidity, this insistence on moving beyond incremental improvements and demanding what we need when, as Grace Lee Boggs says, we have to understand what time it is on the clock of the world. There's not a lot of time to move timidly. We have a planet to save. We have a democracy to try to realize in this country. So I think that is just a really, really important piece for philanthropy to get and to lean into the history of many people, including white folks who sheltered people on the Underground Railroad, who were freedom riders. There is history there that no matter what background we are from, we can call upon and identify with to be bold and courageous and have backbone in this moment.
I'm curious, because you have been on the funding side of the equation. How do you help funders understand what it takes to get rid of the timidity? Because that is a big problem in philanthropy, as you've noted. Are there some arguments that you've seen really work effectively to help people overcome their fears?
Well, the first thing I would say is we talk a lot about the risk of doing things like funding grassroots organizing and funding people of color-led work and work led by women. And I would challenge people to closely examine the risk of not doing it, because we have decades of data that shows us the risk of not doing that, which is ending up exactly where we are here. The other piece is, like, at the end of the day, we all have to look ourselves in the mirror and understand whether we did the right and moral thing. And, we have to remember that, hiding the people who hit Anne Frank were breaking the law, and the people who killed her were following it. So at the end of the day, we have to look ourselves in our mirror. We have to look our children in the face and stand up and be able to stand in what we did in this moment in history.
I think one of the things in the book that you do so well is talk about the challenges that all leaders face, but disproportionately affect women of color. And I was wondering if you can talk about what some of those things are so that we can address them and think hard about what we want to do to fix some of those problems.
Well, this ascension that we were talking about, all this women of color coming to leadership, we were kind of welcomed into leadership like Jackie Robinson was welcomed into the majors. We were treated differently from our white and male counterparts from the start. My dear friend Ashley Woodard Henderson describes it as the sensation of trying to fly a plane while being shot at from both the outside and the inside at the same time. So there's a long list of things that make leadership treacherous for us. So number one is being invited onto a glass cliff to lead an organization in crisis. Number two is the assumption of incompetence. Number three is the demand to mother and mammy. Number four is the kind of a zero tolerance policy for mistakes, whether those are real or perceived. And number five is being abandoned when you're attacked. So let me break down a little bit with some examples of what that looks like.
That would be great. Thank you.
So invitation onto a glass cliff looks like what happened to one leader I interviewed who, after a few weeks, new on the job, she replaced a white CEO. She was told by the controller that there wasn't enough money in the bank to make payroll at the end of the month. And so she then begins to work round the clock for months on end, weathering her own health, knowing that even though she didn't create this problem, that she's going to be the one blamed for it. So it's, you either work your black or brown girl magic or you take the fall for someone else's mess. Philanthropy sometimes participates in this by letting these leaders take the fall for what they inherited and backing away instead of leading in with more funding when they take the helm. So we need to get better at that.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the easy things for philanthropy to do, to recognize there's a transition and say, we're going to fund this instead of making it so difficult. I think that's a very easy, practical suggestion. And yet, that's not what happens typically in philanthropy. It's very hard to raise money when you're a new
Yeah,
leader.
absolutely. The assumption of incompetence, that looks like the toll it takes on our bodies and minds to have to work 4 times as hard to be seen as half as credible. So, one of the most poignant stories I heard was from a excellent organizer out of Chicago, Amisha Patel, who told me how during her first round of cancer, she worked through chemo and radiation. So she was in a
Mm.
New York City bathroom outside of a meeting when her hair started falling out. And she was holding clumps of it in her hands and weeping in the bathroom. She knew that this was coming, but she didn't feel like she could slow down. And so this assumption of incompetence, this feeling that you'll be discarded or thrown away if you're not delivering excellence all the time. And, philanthropy can participate in that too by subjecting us to more scrutiny, asking us to work harder, jump through more hoops to prove ourselves. So, we need to think about that. We need to compensate people for their time. Don't just assume that women of color should be happy to be there in the room just because there's funders and money in the room. Honor people, compensate them for their time. The demand to mother and mammy, it looks like being labeled mean or aggressive for just a normal level of assertiveness that would be accepted from any other leader. It looks like being cast as unfeeling or, cold whenever you say no. And this expectation that work environments not just be fair or just places where people have a voice on the job, but that they be utopias where people never experience discomfort or a trigger, and then the punishment that is meted out when you don't deliver on that impossible standard. So one leader I talked to, Purvi Shah, who runs the Movement Law Lab, described a time when she was trying to hold a staff member accountable for being just combative and uncooperative beyond any level of decorum, and only to be told by her boss, I think you're just not nurturing them enough. So, this is this is what it looks like. And then being abandoned when attacked looks like what happened to the leaders of the original Women's March. There were 4 of them. Only the 3 who were women of color were dragged online behind all kinds of false rumors. And people in movement stepped away from them. They wouldn't return their calls. They really left them out in the wind. So, we need to, as I was listening to these stories, this quote from author Carolyn Jess Cook that says, "Why were we taught to be afraid of the witches and not the people who burn them alive?" So we need to look at that and the way in which women of color in particular are often suspected of being witches. And how can philanthropy not buy into that, right? Like not abandon women of color leaders when you hear about a difficult situation in an organization. Get curious, examine the evidence, and if she's in a tough spot and may actually be deserving of support, like put extra support behind her. Don't pull away. So this is kind of these are the things that bench us.
Yes, they get curious, examine the evidence, and provide support. Really important lessons. I'm curious for all of us who are listening to what you have to say. Some of this is on philanthropy for sure, but some of it's on how we all treat each other as leaders and what we can do. What I could do if I saw you in a difficult situation. What are some of the practical things that people who are witnessing some of the things you just talked about, what can we do that's truly helpful and not hurtful?
Yeah. And I think the good news is that there's so much we can do and that we have the power to do both systemically and individually. My eldest daughter's a swimmer, and I was at her swim meet, and I spotted this other mother who was sitting in a folding chair. She was completely exhausted, and she had fallen asleep with her mouth open, and she had this book across her chest that said, "What to do when he won't change." So my point here is that, the idea that those who participate in the systems that exhaust women of color should be allowed to not change while we just become Jedis at working around all the nonsense, we need to reject that. The notion that's even possible for us to do that is magical thinking. So, others do need to step up and unrig the game for us. And there's a lot of ways to do that. So let me just say, first, systemically, staff organizations can, in their orientations, in their staff trainings, in their employee handbooks, in their political education programs. They can educate and inoculate people about some of these barriers that are just endemic for women of color leaders. My experience is when more people know better, some people will do better. And sometimes it only takes one or two people in a room intervening to be able to shift things. I think managers need to know that it is not a cherry on top or an extra credit assignment to intervene in these things. It is actually should be a core part of their job duties and job description to intervene when these things are occurring. So systemically, there's a lot we can do. Interpersonally, like the assumption of incompetence, for example, we know that leads to a lot of overwork. But I've seen funders who make sure that women of color aren't asked to jump through more hoops than other folks for the same amount of money. That is possible. I've been in rooms where someone attempts to discredit a woman of color for one small error. And I've seen that room shift when someone else speaks up and says, wait a minute, let's put that mistake in the context of the broader success she's had. And by the way, against the context of what she was just up against in the last few months in which this happened. So you can disrupt these things. You can disrupt the adaptive behavior of overwork. I experienced this myself. I think, when my back was, I had a terrible herniated disc and I just would not quit working. And I was prone for
because
a better
you
part
thought
of
you
8 months.
had to, right?
I thought I had to. I really did believe that if I didn't keep up at this pace, this crazy pace that I was at, that I would be discarded, that my work would completely atrophy, and I would lose everything I'd worked for. I had my board chair, Connie Heller, and one of my mentors, Kathy Lerza, that came in and said, you know what? No, you're going to sit down. You have to take a break, and we're going to make a plan to take work off your plate. They did that. I had colleagues who stepped in and took work off my plate so that the work didn't crash. So that kind of firm insistence, but also paired with support, was really key. And then this piece of like leaving women of color in the wind when they're attacked. Say if you hear a rumor circulating about a woman of color, you don't necessarily have to even rebut it directly. It can be powerful to just intervene by saying something like, I've worked with this person for X number of years, and it's interesting to hear this, but that's never been my experience with her. Give people another data point. Don't just allow bad actors to be the only perspective that people hear, because that silence really enables the mistreatment of women of color. And this is one of I think the kind of intense pieces of the book is that, in doing these interviews and talking to folks, there's such a parallel between the silence that surrounds what happens to women of color and the silence around rape culture. And, anyone who thinks that a woman of color leader being dragged online is a tyrant who deserves it should consider that until very recently, most women who were raped were considered to be sluts who asked for it. So facts still matter. The measure of your character isn't only what you do, but it's what you allow. So intervene. So there's a lot of ways to do this and, to step in to take care of things so that leaders don't have to. They don't have to always be the one defending themselves.
That's right. It does not have to always be the leader. It needs to come from the rest of the room. One of the things that a lot of leaders are dealing with in this moment, when the country is so divided, our organizations are divided. We've got 4 or 5 generations sometimes in the workplace. And I know one of the things that you write about powerfully in the book is how to overcome some of that division in ways that are truly successful. Could you talk briefly about some of the things that you've seen work?
I think that there are some things women of color point to that we need to unrig in our movement spaces and organizations in order to really get out of this division mindset that we've been in a really, really difficult way the past few years. One of the things is movements have really allowed this major overcorrection to happen. So we've gone from over-focusing on the external and allowing inhumane conditions to flourish in the workplace, to navel gazing in a quest for total comfort in the workplace while the external mission really atrophies. We've gone from, sweeping blatant racism, xenophobia, and transphobia and other forms of discrimination under the carpet to then allowing false accusations of discrimination to become a cheap and easy tool with which to carry out vendettas and destroy people and organizations. I think what's interesting about women of color leaders is that we're not wedded to the old extremes, because those were brutal for us as well. And in fact, we've been at the vanguard of creating more humane spaces at work, like bringing healing justice in and sabbaticals and all of those things. But we're also highly motivated to get out of the overcorrection, because we're being harmed by it more than almost anyone else. And, it's this compounding effect. So if you were burdened by the expectation to mother and mammy and nurture, the expectation to produce a utopian working condition layered on top of that is killer. So, there's a set of things that we've pointed to that really need to go, that relate also to creating unity and getting out of division. One is performative call-outs.
What do you mean by that?
So, we've got diverse teams, right? We don't want the bar to be so low that the racist uncle, is like allowed to carry on without being checked and continue to damage people. But we don't want it so high that the well-meaning elder or the person on a learning curve who is really trying their hardest but doesn't have the movement lingo, that they get eviscerated. So, having the rigor in place where you do the work, you don't keep making the same mistake, but we also want to have grace for people who are truly putting in the effort to learn. And we want to get out of this trend of just one-upping people and humiliating them. That's one thing that needs to go. Another thing that needs to go is this trend of taking tools or norms of movement work that we actually need in order to win, and then attaching some harmful label to them and then throwing them out. So for example, conflating all rigor with exploitation, any discomfort with being harmed, all positional power with abuse, all feedback with oppression. This kind of thing is making the work sloppy. It's making it unstrategic, and we need to be done with that. Another thing that needs to go is this trend of being silent bystanders while swarms of people crusade on behalf of others without any facts or evidence. Why are we allowing this? This is not solidarity. This is a mob mentality. And that kind of mentality in the ranks of the left, it tills the soil for fascism. It trains our people to be uncritical and to abandon their powers of discernment. And we have to be more disciplined than this. When we see that kind of swarm taking shape, discipline in our practice looks like intervening to disrupt it. So, these are some of the things, one last thing I'll say is that, there's this piece that happens for people of color and for many women of color about seeding things, where we are pressured to kind of seed things like excellence, rigor, timeliness, discipline into the domain of white supremacy culture. Why are we doing this? This entire thing is not only ahistorical, it is profoundly disrespectful to histories of Black and brown excellence that were never about the white gaze. They were always about delivering the best to our own communities. And so many women of color have been accused of white supremacy for asking people to do things like show up to work on time and edit documents. It's ridiculous and it's dangerous. And then the last piece is just fragility. I think that this trend of fragility and entitlement has to go. And, I will say, as a former union organizer, okay, who supports everyone's right to have a union, who firmly believes in fairness and dignity on the job, let me just say, some people are fighting for the right to be excellent in a workplace that has sustainability. Other people are fighting for the right to be mediocre or worse in a workplace that has no accountability. So we need to embrace the former and reject the latter. And we need to really stop pretending that these are the same thing, because there are very few other professions that allow this. You are never going to see a fire department that, accommodates people who, once they're hired, say, I'm going to be, totally honest with you. I'm here to be in the calendar and ring the bell on the truck, but, hot things really trigger me. No, man, why are we letting these people near the controls? It's way too serious outside for us to be doing that. We can love and have empathy with everyone. Everybody find where they want to be, but let's be clear. Some people, it's a loving invitation to find some other place to go if this is not for you. So I think we just have to bring back some rigor and discipline into the work.
It's really strong advice. And to take it back to the title of your book, that's what it takes to win, right? That we can't be acting the way we are in some of our organizations. I know you've had to navigate lots of divisions within the organizations that you've led. Is there a good example or two of what you did to navigate in this difficult time that you could share with us that will help others learn?
Yeah, well, I remember a moment where, we were in a staff meeting and there was a woman of color staff member who had a reaction to a white woman on staff. And, there was a backstory to what was behind that. And but I think in the moment, people are in their pain and their trauma and things that they have experienced previously. And the room spun out of control for a little while with people having a lot of hurt feelings. And the thing that brought it back in to kind of a stable and calm place was actually a single elder who pulled both people aside and had a heart-to-heart conversation where they could really slow things down. And I think that ability to intervene and slow down is important. It's very hard to do in climates where there's a lot of fear, but that is a muscle that we absolutely need to build in these times because we can't afford for things to spin out of control. We actually have to bring back those moments of stabilization and calm and working things through face to face.
Yeah, that's really a good advice to say, just slow down and don't necessarily assume the worst, which is hard in those moments too for people, but what we as leaders often have to say. I really appreciate all the advice you've offered today. I want to end with this conversation with how we close every single one of them. And I'm wondering, how do you recharge? You have had so much on your plate, and I'm curious what it is that you do that helps bring you back to your sense of purpose and mission.
Yeah, well, it comes down to family and friends. I spend time with my kids, my dog. On a rainy day, it's snuggled up with games or watching a movie. On the sunny days, it's all of us piled on a paddleboard, including the dog. So I just think in these times, connection, love, joy are just so important. And that is an affirmation of our joy and our humanity, which they can never take from us.
Yes, and making plenty of room and time to do that. I'm glad you are doing that to help you recharge. I'm even happier that you wrote this book to share all of these lessons with all of us. And I want to thank you for joining us today. It was a wonderful conversation, and I know it will enrich the lives of many of our listeners.
Thank you so much, Stacy. It was a pleasure.